how the Axis economy collapsed before the war even ended. Part 1. The Illusion of Strength. Built on sand, the structural weaknesses of the Axis economic model. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes right before things fall apart. In 1940, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, looked from the outside like economic and military juggernauts. Their armies were moving across continents. Their factories were running day and night. Their leaders appeared on cinema screens, in newspapers, on radio broadcasts, promising an age of dominance that would reshape the world for centuries to come. But underneath those images, behind the parades and the production figures and the propaganda, the ledgers told a different story. And ledgers, unlike generals, do not lie. To understand how the Axis economy was already failing before the war reached its conclusion, you have to go back further than 1939. You have to go back to the 1930s, to the choices made during peacetime. Choices that were celebrated at the time as strokes of genius, but that carried hidden costs no one in power wanted to acknowledge openly. Germany, under the Nazi regime, had achieved something that genuinely impressed economists around the world. It had pulled itself out of the Great Depression faster than almost any other industrialized nation. Unemployment, which had been catastrophic in the early 1930s, was dramatically reduced within a few years of Hitler coming to power. Industrial output climbed. Infrastructure was built. The country, at least on the surface, hummed with productive energy. What the official figures obscured was the mechanism behind that recovery. Germany's rearmament boom was not financed through conventional means. The government had neither the tax revenue nor the foreign credit to fund the scale of military expansion it was pursuing. So it invented a workaround, a system of fictitious bills, the so-called MIFO bills, created by a dummy corporation set up specifically for the purpose. These bills functioned like government debt, but they did not appear on the public balance sheet. They were, in essence, a way of borrowing money while pretending not to borrow money. By 1938, the total value of these hidden obligations was staggering. The economist Hjalmar Schacht, who had been one of the architects of the early recovery, grew alarmed and resigned. His replacement was more accommodating. But the problem did not go away because the personnel changed. The debt existed. The inflation pressure existed. And Germany was already spending in real terms more on its military than its economy could organically sustain. This created a logic, if logic is even the right word, that pointed in only one direction: expansion. The acquisition of Austria in 1938, then the Sudetenland, then the rest of Czechoslovakia, were not only ideological projects, they were economic ones. Each acquisition brought resources, foreign reserves, industrial capacity, and forced labor. The Reich was, from a financial standpoint, addicted to conquest. It needed to keep taking in order to keep functioning. When the war began in 1939, this dependency did not diminish. It intensified. The occupation of Western Europe in 1940 brought an enormous short-term windfall. France alone was forced to pay occupation costs so inflated that they amounted effectively to a massive ongoing transfer of wealth to Germany. The Dutch, Belgian, and Norwegian economies were similarly stripped. Gold reserves were seized. Industrial output was redirected. Workers were conscripted or coerced into German war production. For a time, this worked. The Wehrmacht was, in the early years of the war, being subsidized by the territories it was conquering. Soldiers in France reported being paid in occupation currency specifically so they could buy goods that were unavailable back home, the result of shortages that the German government preferred to export rather than admit to its own population. But this model had an obvious and fatal flaw. It only functioned as long as there was somewhere new to conquer. The moment expansion stopped, or worse, went into reverse, the underlying structure of the German economy would be exposed. There was no sustainable domestic base beneath the military machine. There was no reserve of accumulated wealth to draw upon. There was only forward momentum, and the assumption that forward momentum could be maintained indefinitely. That assumption would not survive contact with the Soviet Union. Japan's economic situation in the late 1930s was different in its details, but parallel in its logic. Where Germany lacked financial sustainability, Japan lacked physical resources. The Japanese home islands had almost none of the raw materials that industrial warfare required. No significant oil, minimal iron ore, insufficient rubber, aluminum, copper. Japan was, in the most literal sense, dependent on the outside world to sustain even its peacetime economy, and its wartime ambitions were vastly more demanding than peacetime. The war in China, which had been grinding on since 1937, was consuming resources at a rate that alarmed more cautious voices within the Japanese government. The military budget as a share of national income had reached levels that most economists would recognize as unsustainable. Japan was burning through foreign exchange reserves trying to purchase the materials it needed, and those reserves were not infinite. The decision to move into Southeast Asia, into the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, was driven as much by economic desperation as by imperial ambition. Japan's leadership calculated, and the calculation was not entirely unreasonable, that if it did not secure those resources by force, it would be slowly strangled by an embargo. The United States had already begun restricting exports of scrap metal and aviation fuel. A full oil embargo, which arrived in mid-1941, made the calculus feel even more urgent. What that calculus consistently underestimated was the scale of American industrial capacity and the speed with which it could be mobilized. Japan's war planners were working with a model of the conflict that assumed a negotiated settlement, a short, sharp war that would establish a Pacific sphere of influence before America could effectively respond. Admiral Yamamoto, who understood American industrial capacity better than most of his peers, reportedly said he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. He was not wrong, but the strategy had no answer for what came after. The attack on Pearl Harbor was, from a purely economic perspective, a nation gambling everything on a winning hand it was not certain it held. Italy presents perhaps the most instructive case of all, because Italy's economic limitations were the most visible and the least honestly confronted by its own leadership. Mussolini's Italy had spent the 1930s on an exhausting series of foreign adventures. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 had cost more than anticipated and produced less than promised. The intervention in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 onward drained manpower, equipment, and money that the Italian military could not easily replenish. By the time the Second World War began in earnest, Italy's foreign currency reserves could sustain serious military operations for a matter of months, not years. The Italian industrial base was simply not comparable to that of the major powers. Steel production, coal consumption, motorization rates. On every significant metric, Italy lagged far behind Germany, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The Italian military entered the war with equipment that was, in many categories, already obsolescent. Its tanks were underarmed and underarmored compared to what they would face in North Africa. Its air force was flying biplanes in some squadrons as late as 1940. Its navy, while formidable on paper, was crippled by chronic fuel shortages, almost from the beginning of the conflict. Mussolini was aware of some of these problems, but chose to minimize them, publicly and apparently in his own thinking. He had convinced himself, and tried to convince his military advisors, that the war would be short, that Germany's victories would quickly create a new European order from which Italy would benefit without bearing the full cost of sustained combat. He waited until France was visibly collapsing before entering the war in June 1940, hoping to gain a seat at the victor's table without enduring the main course. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The war did not end in 1940. France fell, but Britain did not. The conflict expanded rather than contracted, and Italy found itself committed to military campaigns in North Africa, the Balkans, and eventually on its own soil, with an economy that had never been equipped to support them. What united all three Axis economies, beneath their very different national characters and circumstances, was a shared structural problem. They had all built military machines, whose operating costs exceeded what their domestic economies could sustainably generate. They had each financed their initial military buildups through mechanisms, debt concealment, resource seizure, foreign reserve depletion, that worked in the short term, but degraded over time. And they had each arrived at the war with a theory of victory that required the conflict to end quickly. Germany needed a short campaign in the east before Soviet industry could mobilize. Japan needed a short Pacific War before American industry could respond. Italy needed a short European war before its reserves ran out. When none of those short wars materialized, all three found themselves in a contest they had never prepared for. A long industrial war against opponents whose productive capacity they could not match. There is something almost poignant about reviewing the internal documents from this period, the memos, the budget projections, the private correspondence of planners who understood what was happening but could not say so in terms that their political leadership would accept. The German economist who warned about inflation. The Japanese admiral who knew the arithmetic of the Pacific was working against his country. The Italian finance minister who watched the reserves drain and had no answer. They knew. The numbers told them, clearly and early, what the outcome would eventually be. The tragedy, if that is the right word for something so bound up in choices made freely and aggressively, is that knowing and acting on knowledge are two very different things. And in states organized around the will of single leaders and the mythology of national destiny, the distance between those two things could be the entire width of a war. The sand, it turned out, had always been there. It just took time for the structure built on top of it to show the strain. Part 2. The Turning Points. When the Cracks Became Craters, 1942 to 1944. There is a specific kind of momentum that carries failing systems further than they should logically go. Institutions, armies, economies, they often continue operating on inertia long after the conditions that made them viable have disappeared. The machinery keeps turning. The reports keep being filed. The orders keep being issued. And for a while, from the outside, it can look like nothing has fundamentally changed. 1942 is the year the Axis momentum ran out. Not all at once, and not in the same way for each country. The breaking points were separated by months and by oceans. But looking back across the whole arc of the war, what becomes clear is that within a span of roughly 12 months, from the spring of 1942 to the spring of 1943, each of the three major Axis powers crossed a threshold from which their economies would never recover. The battles that defined that period are well known. The economic meaning behind them is less often examined with the attention it deserves. For Japan, the threshold came in June 1942, in the Central Pacific, at a place called Midway. The Battle of Midway lasted 4 days. In that time, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of aircraft, and most critically, the experienced aviators who flew them. The ships were irreplaceable in the short term. The pilots were irreplaceable in any term that mattered to the trajectory of the war. Japan's naval aviation had been built over years of intensive training. The men flying from those carriers in 1942 had accumulated thousands of hours in the air. They had fought in China, over the Pacific, across Southeast Asia. That accumulated experience cannot be manufactured quickly. It has to be grown, slowly, through repetition and survival. When those men died at Midway, they took with them a form of institutional knowledge that Japan's training programs simply could not reconstitute at the pace the war demanded. The industrial dimension of this loss compounded the human one. Japan's aircraft production was already constrained by material shortages. Aluminum in particular was a chronic bottleneck, along with specialized alloys and precision instruments that depended on import chains that were becoming increasingly vulnerable to American submarines. Replacing 4 carriers required years of shipyard work. Replacing the aircraft to fill them required materials Japan was struggling to obtain. Replacing the pilots to fly those aircraft required time that the pace of American operations would not allow. What Midway exposed, beneath the tactical disaster, was the essential fragility of Japan's position, a military instrument of genuine quality, built on an economic base too narrow to sustain attrition. Japan could win battles, it could not afford to lose them. And from Midway onward, the balance of losses in the Pacific moved consistently in one direction. On the other side of the world, in the rubble of a city on the Volga River, Germany was learning the same lesson through different circumstances. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had been conceived as a campaign of weeks. The Soviet Union, the German military planners believed, was politically unstable, organizationally incompetent, and militarily brittle. A series of massive encirclements, Kesselschlacht, cauldron battles, would destroy the Red Army in the field before it could retreat and reconstitute. The campaign would be over before winter. The enormous resources of the Soviet interior, oil, grain, industrial capacity, would pass into German hands, finally providing the economic base the Reich had always lacked. None of that happened. The Red Army was badly damaged, catastrophically so in the opening months. But it did not collapse. The Soviet state did not fracture, and the industrial capacity that the Germans had expected to capture largely escaped their grasp, not because of any single military decision, but because of one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the entire war. Between the summer of 1941 and the end of 1942, the Soviet government organized the displacement of over 1,500 industrial enterprises from the western regions of the country, the areas that were falling to German occupation, and relocated them east of the Ural Mountains. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto rail cars, transported thousands of kilometers, and reassembled on new foundations, often in conditions of extreme cold and with inadequate infrastructure. Workers followed their factories. Production resumed, sometimes within weeks of the equipment arriving at its new location. This is not a well-publicized story in the West, but its consequences for the outcome of the war are difficult to overstate. The Soviet industrial base that Germany had counted on capturing and exploiting was instead reconstituting itself beyond the reach of German forces, in locations that German bombers could not reach and German armies could never approach. While the Wehrmacht was advancing across the steppe, Soviet tank factories in the Urals were accelerating output. Soviet aircraft plants east of the Volga were increasing production. The arithmetic of the Eastern War was shifting, invisibly, while the visible drama of the front lines suggested German dominance. By the time of Stalingrad, the brutal, grinding urban battle that ran from the summer of 1942 into the first days of February 1943, Germany's fundamental problem on the Eastern Front had already been established. It was not a question of tactical skill or individual courage. It was a question of industrial capacity, meeting its limit against an opponent whose industrial capacity was growing. The encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943 cost Germany roughly 300,000 men, along with enormous quantities of irreplaceable equipment. More than the soldiers and the hardware, it cost Germany the myth that had been sustaining civilian and military morale, the myth of inevitable victory. After Stalingrad, the psychological contract between the Nazi state and its population began to erode. That erosion had economic consequences, in labor discipline, in civilian consumption demands, in the political difficulty of making further sacrifices. Albert Speer, appointed as Minister of Armaments in February 1942, was by most accounts a genuinely capable administrator. He rationalized German war production with a methodical intelligence that the previous, more chaotic arrangements had lacked. Under Speer, production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft climbed steadily through 1943 and reached its peak in 1944. The numbers, on paper, looked like success, but Speer was running faster to stay in the same place, and eventually to fall behind. The increased production figures masked several accelerating problems that no administrative reorganization could solve. The first was labor. Germany's wartime economy required workers at a scale that the domestic population could not supply, particularly as military conscription drew more men into uniform. The solution, forced labor from occupied territories, concentration camp inmates, prisoners of war, was both morally catastrophic and economically inefficient. Coerced workers working in fear, in inadequate conditions, with insufficient nutrition, do not produce at the rates that free workers produce. Output per worker in the forced labor system was consistently below what the regime's planners projected. The gap between expected and actual production widened steadily. The second problem was raw materials. Germany's access to key inputs, particularly oil, nickel, and certain specialty metals, was constrained and becoming more so as the war's geography shifted. Romanian oil, from the Ploiești fields, was supplying a significant portion of Germany's fuel requirements. It was also becoming a high-priority target for Allied strategic bombing. The third problem was the bombing itself. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany intensified significantly in 1943 and reached a new level of precision and scale in 1944. For much of the early period, the bombing caused enormous human suffering and physical destruction without achieving decisive economic effect. The German economy proved more resilient to general area bombing than the pre-war theorists had predicted. But when the targeting shifted to specific industrial bottlenecks, particularly synthetic fuel production and transportation infrastructure, the effects were profound. Germany's fuel supply, already under pressure from the demands of a war fought across multiple continents, began to be systematically dismantled from the air. The synthetic fuel plants that processed coal into aviation fuel and motor fuel were identified, targeted, and repeatedly attacked. Each attack set back production. Each reconstruction was followed by another attack. The cumulative effect through the second half of 1944 was a fuel crisis that propagated through every branch of the German military. Pilots in training were flying fewer hours because there was not enough fuel for full training programs. This meant pilots were reaching combat with less experience and dying faster, which meant Germany needed even more replacement pilots, who were also flying with less training. The cycle was self-reinforcing and pointed in only one direction. Tanks were being held in reserve, not for strategic reasons, but because there was insufficient fuel to operate them in exercises. Artillery units were rationing shells because the transportation network that delivered supplies had been disrupted by bombing. The German military in 1944 was still a formidable fighting force. It would prove that repeatedly in defensive battles on both eastern and western fronts. But it was a fighting force that was being slowly drained of the material prerequisites for sustained offensive action. Italy did not wait for 1944 to reach its breaking point. It arrived there in 1943, and its collapse was the most complete and the most publicly visible of any Axis power during the war's middle period. By the spring of 1943, Italy's war had gone comprehensively wrong on every front where Italian forces were committed. North Africa, which Mussolini had envisioned as the foundation of a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, had become a grinding attrition campaign that Italian industry could not support. Food rationing in Italian cities was reaching levels that caused genuine hardship. Industrial workers in Turin and Milan went on strike in March 1943, the first significant strikes in occupied Western Europe, protesting wartime conditions that had become intolerable. The strikes were suppressed, but the signal they sent was unmistakable. The population's tolerance for sacrifice in a war that was visibly failing had been exhausted. The Allied landings in Sicily on July 10, 1943, triggered the final political crisis. Within 2 weeks, Mussolini was voted out of power by the fascist Grand Council and arrested. The king appointed a new government under Marshal Badoglio, which immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies. In September 1943, Italy formally surrendered. The Italian case is instructive precisely because it happened first and most rapidly. The economic foundation had been the weakest. The gap between military ambition and industrial capacity had been the widest, and so Italy reached the point of unsustainability before its larger partners did, demonstrating, in compressed and visible form, the process that was working more slowly, but just as certainly in Germany and Japan. What 1942 and 1943 reveal, taken together, is that the Axis economic crisis was not a single event, but a convergence of separate crises, each following its own timeline, each driven by the specific vulnerabilities of a particular national economy, pushed beyond what it could sustain. The battles were real. The suffering was real. The courage on all sides was real. But running beneath all of it, like a current beneath choppy water, was the economic reality that had been visible in the ledgers since before the first shots were fired. By the midpoint of the war, that reality had surfaced. It would not submerge again. What remained was the arithmetic of defeat, patient, indifferent, and already calculating its final answer. Part 3. The Arithmetic of Defeat. What the numbers always knew. Defeat rarely arrives as a single moment. It accumulates. It gathers in the margins of supply reports and in the silences of planning meetings, where certain questions stop being asked because everyone already knows the answer. It lives in the gap between what a government tells its people and what the people can see with their own eyes when they look at empty shelves, when they receive the letters, when the electricity cuts out again, and nobody can say when it will return. By 1944, the Axis powers were living inside that gap. The formal end of the war, the surrenders, the ceremonies, the signed documents, was still months away. But the economic contest that determined the outcome had already been decided. What remained was the terrible human cost of fighting a war whose conclusion the numbers had already written. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell, not because the evidence is unclear, but because it requires sitting with a particular kind of grief, the recognition that enormous suffering occurred after the moment when, in any rational accounting, the result was already known. To understand where Germany stood in 1944, it helps to look at a single resource: oil. Modern industrial warfare runs on petroleum. Tanks require it. Aircraft require it. The trucks that move supplies to the front require it. The ships that transport materiel across oceans require it. Without a reliable and sufficient supply of fuel, a 20th century military force does not slow down, it stops. Equipment becomes stationary metal. Training programs become theoretical exercises. Strategic planning becomes an increasingly abstract activity, disconnected from operational reality. Germany had always been vulnerable on this dimension. It had no significant domestic oil production. Its access to petroleum depended on Romanian fields at Ploiești, on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into liquid fuel through an energy-intensive industrial process, and on whatever could be captured or purchased through increasingly restricted trade channels. This vulnerability had been understood by Allied planners for years. The question was whether strategic bombing could be made precise and sustained enough to exploit it decisively. In the spring and summer of 1944, that question was answered. The American 15th Air Force, operating from bases in southern Italy, and the 8th Air Force, operating from England, began a systematic campaign against German oil infrastructure. Ploiești was struck repeatedly. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Perlitz, Berlin, and a dozen other locations were targeted in missions that returned week after week, destroying what had been rebuilt since the previous attack, then returning to destroy the repairs. German anti-aircraft defenses were formidable, and the losses among Allied aircrews were severe. But the campaign continued, and its effects compounded. German aviation fuel production, which had reached approximately 175,000 tons per month in the spring of 1944, fell to roughly 30,000 tons per month by September of that year. The Luftwaffe, which had already been struggling with pilot shortages and aircraft serviceability problems, now faced the additional constraint that its planes could not be fueled for training, for patrol, or for combat at anything close to the rates the tactical situation demanded. New pilots, already undertrained by the standards of 1940 or 1941, were being sent into combat with as few as 150 hours of total flight time. Their life expectancy, measured against the experienced Allied aircrews they faced, was very short. The effect spread outward from aviation into every other branch of the military. Tank crews at training facilities were drilling with reduced fuel allocations, which meant they were going into battle with less practice in the actual operation of their vehicles. Logistics officers were making increasingly agonizing choices about which units received fuel and which went without. Commanders at the operational level were discovering that their strategic options were being narrowed not by the enemy's maneuvers, but by the fuel gauge. This is what systemic economic collapse looks like from the inside. It is not dramatic in the way that a lost battle is dramatic. It is a slow narrowing of possibilities, a gradual reduction in the number of things that can be attempted, a growing gap between what the orders say and what the resources allow. The transportation network was failing in parallel with the fuel supply, and the two failures reinforced each other in ways that multiplied the damage to both. Germany's railway system was the circulatory system of its war economy. Raw materials moved by rail to factories. Finished weapons moved by rail to distribution points. Ammunition, food, replacement parts, reinforcements, all of it depended on a functioning rail network. And the rail network, by the second half of 1944, was under attack from the air with an intensity it could not absorb. Marshalling yards, the hub points where trains were sorted and redirected, were priority targets. Bridges, viaducts, and repair facilities were targeted. The cumulative effect was not to stop the railways entirely, but to reduce their capacity and reliability to the point where the system began to back up. Factories received raw materials late or in insufficient quantities. Finished production sat waiting for transport. Military units waited for supplies that were delayed or lost in the disruption. Each delay cascaded into further delays. Albert Speer, in the final phase of the war, was spending increasing amounts of his administrative energy not on expanding production, but on emergency repairs, workarounds, and improvised solutions to bottlenecks that multiplied faster than they could be addressed. His production figures, which had been a source of genuine pride and some justification in 1943 and early 1944, were becoming increasingly detached from operational reality. Germany was producing weapons that could not be fueled, that could not be transported to the front, that arrived without the ammunition to fire them. The machinery of the war economy was still turning, but what it produced was no longer reaching the battlefield in the quantities or the condition that the situation required. Japan's economic trajectory through 1944 followed a different path to the same destination, and the instrument of its destruction was largely beneath the water rather than above it. American submarine warfare against Japanese merchant shipping had been intensifying since the beginning of the Pacific War. Japan's economic survival depended on a network of sea lanes connecting the home islands to the resource-rich territories it had conquered in Southeast Asia. The oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the bauxite of the Philippines. These materials had to be transported by ship across waters that were becoming increasingly dangerous as American submarines grew more numerous, more capable, and more aggressive in their operations. In 1942 and into 1943, Japanese anti-submarine measures were inadequate, and the losses among merchant vessels were serious but manageable. By 1944, they had become catastrophic. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The tonnage of goods reaching Japan from its southern resource territories fell precipitously. Oil imports, which had been central to the entire strategic logic of the Pacific War, dropped to a fraction of what the Japanese military required. The consequences radiated through every dimension of Japan's war effort. The Imperial Navy, which had been a genuinely formidable force in 1941 and 1942, was by 1944 operating under fuel constraints so severe that major fleet movements required careful calculation of whether ships could complete their missions and return. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval engagement in history by some measures, elements of the Japanese fleet sortied, knowing that fuel shortages might prevent their return. The battle plan itself was organized around the knowledge that the Japanese Navy was a wasting asset that could not be conserved indefinitely. On the home islands, the effects of the shipping losses were becoming visible in civilian life. Rice imports from occupied territories were disrupted. Industrial raw materials were arriving in quantities insufficient to maintain production targets. Workers in Japanese factories were experiencing food shortages that affected their productivity. The government was implementing increasingly stringent rationing programs that touched every aspect of daily life. The B-29 bombing campaign against Japanese cities, which intensified dramatically in early 1945, added another layer of destruction to an industrial base that was already struggling. But it is worth noting that by the time the firebombing of Tokyo and other cities reached its most devastating phase, Japan's economy was already failing by other means. The submarines had done much of the decisive work before the bombers completed it. There is a question that hangs over this entire period, and it deserves to be addressed honestly rather than dismissed. If the economic outcome was already determined by 1944, if the numbers already pointed clearly and unambiguously toward Axis defeat, why did the fighting continue? Why did Germany resist until May 1945? Why did Japan fight on until August of that year, absorbing the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki before surrendering? The answer is not simple, and it is not the same for each country. In Germany, the Nazi state had constructed a political system in which acknowledging defeat was structurally impossible. The ideology of National Socialism could not absorb the concept of national failure. It had no language for it, no framework for transitioning from war to negotiated peace. Hitler's own psychology reinforced this. He repeatedly refused to authorize strategic withdrawals, preferring encirclement and destruction to retreat and reconstitution. The German military continued fighting because the political apparatus that might have authorized a different course of action did not function in a way that made that possible. In Japan, the calculus was different, but produced the same result. The military leadership was divided, and the faction willing to consider surrender faced genuine political danger from elements of the officer corps for whom surrender was literally unthinkable. The emperor's authority was theoretically absolute, but practically constrained by these factional realities. It took the unprecedented personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito, following the atomic bombings and the Soviet declaration of war, to break the deadlock. And even then, the surrender was nearly prevented by a coup attempt within the military. These are political and psychological explanations for a military continuation that the economics had already rendered futile. But they are not separate from the economic story. They are, in a meaningful sense, its final chapter, the documentation of what happens when political systems cannot respond to economic reality, when ideological commitments prevent the kind of rational calculation that the situation demands. The cost of that incapacity was measured in human lives, in numbers large enough that they remain difficult to comprehend even at historical distance. What remains, after all of this, is a question about what the story of the Axis economic collapse means, not as history, which it is, but as something that might illuminate the relationship between economic structure and political ambition more broadly. The Axis powers were not, in the beginning, obviously doomed. Their early military successes were real. Their initial economic mobilizations achieved genuine results. Germany in 1940 was a formidable state by any measure. Japan in 1941 was a serious military power with real strategic vision. The outcome was not predetermined by some law of historical inevitability. What was predetermined, or very close to it, was the consequence of the specific choices each country made in the 1930s. The choice to finance rearmament through concealed debt rather than transparent taxation. The choice to build military machines that required continuous expansion to remain solvent. The choice to plan for short wars, in the absence of any credible economic foundation for long ones. These were decisions made by specific people at specific moments, and different decisions could have been made. What the economic history of the Second World War suggests, and it suggests this with considerable force, is that the relationship between a state's material foundation and its political ambitions is not decorative. It is structural. States that construct their ambitions on top of economic frameworks that cannot sustain them are not simply taking risks. They are building on the same sand that eventually swallowed everything built upon it. The factories told this story first. They told it in the production figures and the fuel reports and the shipping manifests and the labor statistics. They told it clearly, and they told it early. The tragedy is not that the story was hidden. The tragedy is that so few people in positions of power were willing to read it. The numbers had the last word. They almost always do.